Professor Eaton became interested in philosophy at a young age through his fascination with science fiction and time travel. He obtained a BA from Western Illinois University, followed by an MA and a PhD from Southern Illinois University. He then taught at the University of Tennessee before becoming an associate professor of early modern philosophy at Georgie Southern University. He's been teaching philosophy for over 20 years and is currently serving as the chair of philosophy at Georgie Southern. His interests include early modern philosophy, contemporary analytic metaphysics, history and philosophy of science, and philosophy of film. Bill's teaching is influenced by Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and he believes that philosophy is an activity involving a sense of wonder about the universe. So you're already seeing why we got him. When it comes to teaching his students, he tries to provoke their intellectual curiosity by initiating a dialogue with them where they can learn from each other. He enjoys demonstrating how philosophy, even in its most abstract issues, can be linked to their lives. He's also interested in the connections between early modern philosophy and contemporary analytic metaphysics, with some of his favorite philosophers being René Descartes, Daniel Garber, and Tom Stoneham. I haven't mentioned one person yet. He's also authored a book on Boyle called Boyle on Fire, The Mechanical Revolution in Scientific Explanation. And this explores the scientific revolution and 17th century mechanical philosophy by examining Boyle's work using the common method of experiment during the time, the analysis of through fire. And shows how these led to a mechanical model explanation and its role in modern day science. And I should explain how I came to meet Bill first. It was in getting ready for one of the Boyle summer schools. Was it 2013? Was it? Or it was a good while ago, and we saw that there was a group of American students doing their summer school in the college, and I saw them in the canteen, and I said, I wonder would any of them be interested in coming to the Boyle summer school. And I went up and I said, this is the Boyle summer school. I said, I don't know if you know who Robert Boyle is, and I happened to be talking to Bill. So what are the chances? There aren't very many Robert Boyle summer schools in the world, and there actually aren't very many Boyle scholars in the world. So that was a happy occurrence, inexplicable by science. So please welcome Professor Bill Eaton.
All right, how's it going? It's a great honor to be here at the Robert Boyle Summer School. I try to attend this conference as often as I can. It's the only place I don't feel like a freak, where I can talk about Boyle and people at least have heard the name. And when I heard the theme of this year's summer school, Mind and Matter, it really struck home with me. It really resonated with me because it's, in a very real sense, it's almost the culmination of my career. I started my master's work in philosophy on in philosophy of mind, and I was very interested in the problem of consciousness. And that in contemporary philosophy, and the problem of consciousness is almost one of the final frontiers of science. Science has a pretty good understanding of how the universe works, but when it comes to consciousness, it's still very difficult. And so to get things started, I had to almost give a biographical account of how I came to be here. Because it really follows my work from my master's degree to my PhD, and then which sort of shifted focus a little, and then came full circle to where we are now. And I really couldn't have given this presentation before now, but it's a real honor to be here. So, the problem of consciousness. So this is what I looked like when I started working on the problem of consciousness. That was 30 years ago. And so that shows you just how difficult this problem is, and the toll it takes when you work on it. But basically, the problem of consciousness, sometimes it's even called the hard problem of consciousness, is that neuroscience has advanced so much, and our understanding of the brain has advanced so much, that we can basically explain things like cognition, learning, we can explain behavior, we can explain language. But why all those mental processes should be accompanied by conscious experience, by the subjective experience we feel, is still very, very poorly understood. And so that really interested me in my master's degree. And I was really intrigued by philosophers like Thomas Nagel and Frank Jackson, and then later David Chalmers. And what they had in common was they thought there was something inherently subjective about conscious experience. And science is almost purely objective. And in fact, the more objective you are in science, the better science you're doing. But if consciousness is essentially subjective, being more and more objective, finding more objective information about the brain, actually takes you further away. So how do we explain consciousness? And I came to the conclusion that basically consciousness is a natural phenomenon, but it's non-physical. So it's a natural but non-physical phenomenon. And this traces all the way back to philosophers like René Descartes, a substance dualist. And so, yeah, it has to do with qualia. So I might use the term qualia. It's a technical term, but I think we can get it. Qualia stands for the subjective qualities of conscious experience. So what red looks like. So think about the objective information we have about red. You can know the wavelength in the electromagnetic radiation spectrum associated with the color red. You can know what goes on in the brain, in the visual cortex. That wouldn't tell you what red looks like. Red looks like something. And it seems to be inherently subjective. So we use the word qualia to stand for those sorts of subjective qualities of experience. So what the color red looks like, what a rose smells like, what a buran sounds like. I'm sorry. I was practicing too. I knew I wouldn't get it right. Hopefully we'll have the qualia of what Boyle's gin tastes like, and shortly afterwards what wonder feels like. Wonder feels like something. There's something that's like to feel wonder or to see red. And so that's the subjective part I'd argue can't be explained by a purely objective account of the brain, even though we can explain so much with neuroscience. And so we end up back to substance dualism. So this is the view that there's two types of substances in the world, mind and matter. So it fits right in with the theme. The conscious mind is non-physical. The human brain is physical. They're fundamentally different types of reality. Now that sounds very almost superstitious today, but at the time we're dealing with, the time of Boyle, it was actually frontline science. So the most important, or at least the most famous, substance dualist is René Descartes. He believes in mind and matter. But also Robert Boyle's good friend John Locke, and another philosopher I'm going to talk about, Anton Wilhelm Amo. And the reason I'm going to talk about, I won't talk so much about Locke because he's so close to Boyle on this issue. But the reason I'll talk about Amo and Descartes is because you'll see that Boyle's theory of mind fits neatly in between those. They're all three substance dualists. But by understanding a little bit about Descartes and a little bit about Amo, you can kind of see where Boyle incorporates elements of both. And you could contrast that with other mechanical philosophers that were materialists. And this is the view that there's only one kind of substance, matter. So you're a dualist if you think there's two kinds of substance, mind and matter. You're a materialist if you think there's only matter. If you go up the road to Kilkenny, you'll see Berkeley, and he believes there's only mind. So yeah. We'll talk a little bit about Descartes and a little bit about ammo. And really, by this time, I was moving in, and this is sort of the autobiographical part. I was moving. My interest kind of after my master's moved into more philosophy of science, and I became interested in questions like what's a scientific explanation, how does science differ from pseudoscience, and importantly, what role does experiment play in science? I realized, working on philosophy of mind and the problem of consciousness, that too few philosophers working in philosophy of mind, I'm a philosopher, by the way, know anything about the brain. And so I wanted to learn more about the brain. I took brain anatomy classes. Like Descartes and Boyle, I even dissected some human brains. Not many, but you'd be surprised in the great variation of brains. They come in all sizes and shapes. I learned a lot about how the brain works, but I also learned a lot about why I'm not a medical student. I had to take that class over in the medical, and thank God there are medical students, but they're just a different sort. If there's any doctor, MDs here, I apologize. I saw one guy with a brain in one hand and his lunch sandwich in the other. But yeah, after my master's, my interest shifted to philosophy of science, and it came back around to Descartes and Boyle because they're also mechanical philosophers. So basically, the mechanical philosophy is the view that at least all natural phenomena can be explained in terms of matter and motion, in terms of mechanism. These philosophers saw the universe as a giant machine, a divinely constructed machine. And if it's a machine, you can figure out how it works, including the human body. If we view the body as this divine machine, we can understand how it works and fix it when it breaks and potentially keep it going. I realized that, and this is a more recent discovery than I'd like to admit, but I came to realize, I knew Boyle was a dualist, but I really was more interested in his philosophy of science. But I lately realized that for these philosophers, and I realized that teaching philosophy of mind, because a lot of my students don't make this connection, but the philosophers we're talking about, Descartes, Boyle, Amo, they think of the mind and the soul as just the same thing. They're identical. Your body, your brain might die, it's physical, but they thought your mind, your consciousness, your soul could survive the death of the body. And I realized, because if you look at Boyle's vast corpus, long-winded corpus, and I have, in great detail, he doesn't say much about the mind. I've only found, and there's, 14 volumes of his collected works? That's just the published works, so not to mention his correspondence and his work diaries. I've only found 2 places where he even uses the term consciousness. He never talks about the mind. That never bothered me because I was more interested in his scientific method, mechanical philosophy. But recently, I discovered that for him, the mind and soul are identical. That was sort of a common belief back then. And I don't know how much you know about Boyle. After this, you'll know more than you wanted to. But he was a polymath. He had all sorts of interests. And just in science alone, not just chemistry and pneumatics, but agriculture and extending the human lifespan. Just in science, he usually had 20 different projects going at any one time. Some experiments he'd do, but he was very wealthy, so he could fund other experiments. But that was only part of him. He was also a very deeply religious person. he would spend hours, just as much time and attention in the detail he spends in science and alchemy, he spent on studying ancient religious languages, conferring with rabbis about the meaning of the Torah. I mean, he was very devout. And then on top of that, he was involved in something called, the word's failing me now, scruloscopy? It's this thing that was popular at the time. It was this analysis of your own conscience. So not consciousness, but conscience. And he'd spend hours scrutinizing over every decision he made, every action he did. You know how you shouldn't dwell on the past? He did dwell on it. He dwelled on every, I think, it's in the past, try and be better next time, move on. But he scrutinized his own moral decisions. So while he doesn't have much to say about the mind, he has all sorts of things to say about the soul. And I realized we can, by looking at what he says about the soul, we can construct his theory of the mind. And so that's what I'm going to do today, basically. We'll have to jump around throughout his career, but there's a consistent picture you see that will give us his theory of the mind. His theory is basically Cartesian, so he basically agrees with Descartes' substance dualism. There's two substances, mind and body. But it differs in an important way that two things. One, allows Boyle to better explain animal consciousness, which something Descartes notoriously couldn't do. And we'll talk about that. But it also allows Boyle to make significant progress on what's called the mind-body problem. If the mind really is non-physical, how could that causally interact with something physical like a brain? And yet they do causally interact. I can have a mental state, a volition, a will to raise my arm, and then my body does it. So that's mind-to-body causation. But there's also body-to-mind causation. Sorry about this. Okay. So that's pain. What I won't do for a Boyle presentation. That was a physical thing that happened that now caused a mental sensation and is still kind of causing it. So there's obviously mind-body interaction, but how does that happen? That's the mind-body problem. I think Boyle makes significant progress. He doesn't solve it, but makes significant progress towards solving it. Okay, so I'm going to say and I'll try and be as brief as I can. I'm going to say just a little bit about Descartes' substance dualism. So again, Descartes believes there are two substances, mind and matter, theme of the talk. And he thinks each one has an essential attribute. And so what an attribute is, he means it very technically. An attribute is the one essential property he thinks each substance has, through which all its other properties can be understood. So for Descartes, the attribute, the essence of mind is thought. So he thinks all properties of the mind are different types of thought. And he means thought in a very broad context. So having an idea is a type of thought, but also feeling an emotion. Anything you can be consciously aware of is he describes as a thought. So perceptions, you're seeing me right now, you're hearing me, those are types of thought. Those are modes of the mind for Descartes. Any property the mind has is a type of thought. It gets weird, but for matter, the other substance, he thinks its essence is spatial extension, the capacity to occupy space, he thought. And he has some very clever arguments to show this that we won't go into. But yeah, he thinks the absolute essence of matter, of physical matter, is extension in space. And so all its properties, all the properties of matter, are ways of occupying space, like size and shape and motion. And then we'll look at very briefly at the dualism of Anton Wilhelm Amo and his theory of mind. He's a very fascinating figure in 17th century thought. And I could talk maybe over a pint later or something. I can tell you all about him. Once you get me started, it's hard to shut up about him. Not enough people know about his philosophy. And it's just his life story. They'll never make a movie of it because you wouldn't believe it. He was born in Ghana, in Africa, kidnapped by the Dutch East India Company, and given to the Duke of Wolfbuttle Brunswick, who gave ammo to his son, who was about the same age, as sort of a playmate. But they grew up into being best friends and really brothers. And when the old Duke died, the new Duke saw to his education. He becomes a philosophy professor. Even gives lectures at the University of Hull and the University of Jena. Eventually makes it back to Africa and reunites with a brother and, a sister and his father. Think about, for a second, and then I'll move on, but think for a second about all the lives that were destroyed by the African slave trade and how few ever made it back to their home to reunite with their families. You could probably count it on your head. He did. So yeah, I mean, he's a fascinating character. He's also a substance dualist, but he's trying to reconcile Descartes' new philosophy, whose success can't be denied. They're doing all sorts of incredible science with it, with the traditional Aristotelian model. And so he's a dualist. Where he differs from Descartes is on the attribute, the essence of each one. So again, for Descartes, the essence of mind is thought, the essence of matter is spatial extension. For Amo, the essence of mind is activity, and the essence of body is passivity. The idea is that basically bodies are passive. Physical objects are passive. They can be acted upon, but they can't act themselves. Where minds, he thinks, are pure activity, pure will. It's still non-physical, but that's the essence of each one. And that has some interesting consequences. For instance, since it was a conscious perception, since you're consciously aware of your perceptions, they count as modes of thought for Descartes. But since your perceptions are passive, they happen to you. For Amo, that makes them physical. So according to Amo, it's your eyeballs that do the seeing, not your soul. It's your stomach that gets hungry right about now, probably. Not your soul. And this turns out to be really important, since Descartes, for religious reasons, wanted to deny that non-human animals had immortal souls. They didn't have minds either, because they were just the same thing for Descartes. So he notoriously thought that animals were just like robots. They were machines. They could maybe display pain behavior, but they couldn't really feel anything. For Amo, he thinks, and this goes back to Aristotle, but he thinks there's two types of souls. There's a sensitive soul, and that involves your perceptions, but special humans have rational souls. So it's still a dualism, but it's different. I'm going to now show that, finally, talk about Boyle's theory of mind, and I'll show you how it kind of falls neatly, I think neatly, between both of those views. So this is Boyle now. First of all, he thinks the rational soul is endowed with two faculties, the understanding and the will. And this is straight out of Descartes. He learned most of Descartes from Robert Hooke, his lab partner, and a great philosopher in his own right. He had only read a little bit of Descartes' Passions of the Soul, I think, before he met Hooke, which a lot of Boyle scholars sort of dismiss and downplay, but actually it's a pretty significant. But yeah, the soul, which alone is capable of wearing the glorious image of its author, being endowed with two chief faculties, the understanding and the will. So yeah, that's straight up Descartes. This part is not Descartes. He thinks that this is Boyle. He thinks the rational soul is infused into the human body when the fetus is about 6 weeks old. And here's a great quote. The human body, as exquisite an engine as 'tis justly esteemed, is formed without the intervention of the rational soul, which is not infused into the body until this has attained an organization that fits it to receive such a guest, which is commonly reputed to happen around the end of the 6th week. I find that fascinating. So the soul isn't connected to the body at conception. For him, it happens around 6 weeks, almost the beginning of the 7th week, which interestingly is about the time of the fetus the brain starts developing. So how did he know that? And this, you can see the connection to Descartes' philosophy. He thinks the soul lacks spatial extension. That's part of the reason it's a different substance. It doesn't occupy space. So he says, for the rational soul is capable of understanding and willing, which are higher faculties than mere matter can reach to, and which is more of knowing, serving, and enjoying God. And that littleness that is alleged to make a contemptible creature is so far from being a disparagement to that noble part of him, the soul, which makes him a man that is a rational creature, that its excellency consists in being less than the minutest body, since not having an extension, it's not divisible, which is the prerogative of substances which for that reason are immaterial and immortal. So again, that's very Cartesian. The soul lacks spatial extension. And that's what makes it more excellent than a mere body. But this presents a real problem for Boyle's philosophy, one that I haven't been able to reconcile. I think he might just have to bite the bullet on this one. Infusion is a spatial concept. If the soul's infused in the body, how can it lack extension? So the concept of infusion, and he thinks the soul is infused throughout the body, that implies it's spatial. And so I tried to get him out in a couple of different ways, but I at the end of the day, I don't think he can. He might be able to claim that the way the soul can infuse in the body and yet be non-spatial is just beyond our finite capacity to understand. He wrote a whole book about things that are beyond reason, things that we know are true, but a lot of them are religious, things that we know are true, but are just beyond our rational capability. And non-spatial infusion might be one such thing. He goes so far as to say, after we die and our rational soul leaves the body and is with God and the angels, maybe at that point we'll understand how that's possible. But in our current position, we can't understand it. To me, that sort of is a proof surrogate. It begs the question. It says there is this kind of explanation, but we just can't know it. Another way for him to dodge it is maybe by looking at a more archaic meaning of the term infuse. It also means to introduce. So maybe when he says the soul's infused in the body, it's really just introduced to the body. But that doesn't seem likely given the context. So I think this is a real problem. He wants the soul to be infused, but that seems like it's spatial. Ammo gets around it by saying the soul has a spatial location in the body as a space-time point. So it lacks spatial extension, but still has a location. It's not clear Boyle thought anything like that. But the rational soul is the source of personal identity. We'll be talking more about the self and identity in this summer school. So since then a human body is not so confined to a determinate bulk, but that the same soul being united to a portion of duly organized matter is said to constitute the same man, notwithstanding the vast differences of bigness that there may be at several times between portions of matter whereto the human soul is united. So what's going on here? Well, I think it anticipates John Locke's famous Prince and the Cobbler by a couple of years at least. They were good friends. But basically, the issue here is, what makes you the same person over time? What makes you the same person now that you were last night when we were talking about horrible serial killers? Or makes you the same person now that you will be tomorrow when you're at the garden party? The initial knee-jerk response is, well, I have the same body. I'm the same person over time because I have the same body over time. But a moment's reflection will show you that you don't really quite have the same body. I don't have the same body as I used to when I started working on the problem of consciousness. But, your cells are replaced constantly. The collection of particles that make up your body now is not the same as it was when you were 10, or you will be next year. You have the majority of your cells are replaced every 8 months or so. There are some that stick around. How can you establish a criterion that makes you the same person over time? Well, Boyle did it by appealing to the rational soul. The parts of your body might change over time, but you're the same person because you have that same soul. So since he has the mind or the soul in there, he's making it work. He does something similar with free will. The rational soul is going to be the source of free will. Diverse, intricate questions in theology about man's free will and the operations of the intellect upon the will and the will upon the intellect may probably, as I have elsewhere shown, now I haven't been able to find out the elsewhere part. I don't know where else he talks about it. Can be avoided by giving such a notion of freedom of the rational soul as just its dependence on the first cause. It's the immaterial rational soul that is also the source of not only personal identity but free will. This is where it gets really interesting, to me at least. He is ahead of his time in understanding that sensation requires a body. So even if the rational soul is non-physical, it still requires a body to sense, to have sensations. For all we naturally know, a human soul separated from the body may be united to such a portion of matter that she may neither have the power to move it, nor the advantage of receiving any agreeable information by its interventions, having upon account of that union no other sense than that of pain. But let us now consider what will follow if I should grant that the soul will not be made miserable, but being this wretchedly matched. Suppose then that she be left to freely enjoy what belongs to the soul's own nature, that being only the power of always thinking. It may well be doubted whether the exercise of that power will suffice to make her happy. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, so I want to kind of unpack it. What he's saying is he's speculating about the nature of the soul after death. He thinks the soul could, if God wants it to, continue to exist after the death of the body, but he realizes it wouldn't be able to have sensations. So imagine an afterlife where you're conscious, you can think, but you can't see or hear or feel or anything. He thinks, how would you be happy in that state? And there's a great passage where he talks about how he enjoys time alone. He'd rather go to a pub and read a book than go to a party. There's one passage where it really shows how rich this guy was. He talks about, there's been many a night where I've gone to a pub, I've avoided a party, gone to a pub with a book and just one servant. So even when this guy goes to read a book, he's got a butler with him. He also recounts this very interesting story about a Spanish nobleman he knew that committed some crime and was punished instead of by being executed by being basically solitary confinement, thrown in a cell that was dark. They fed him, but then they didn't talk to him for 1 year. And how the psychological toll that takes. So the idea that solitary confinement is inhumane. It seems like Boyle was aware of that too. The guy tried to pass the time thinking, but eventually would just drink wine and pass out every day to get through this year. And it made me think of all the poor people today in solitary confinement that don't have wine. What are they going to do? But this guy was noble enough that he still got good food. Boyle thinks it's possible that in the afterlife, our mind could be united to another body, maybe like reincarnation, or maybe our own body's resurrected. He thinks it's at least possible, but he thinks you need some kind of body to have sensations. Not to be conscious necessarily, but to have sensations. And because we know about people that are paralyzed or people that are mute, he realized you could be connected to a body that you couldn't move, for all we know. So I think it's very interesting speculation that even if the soul somehow does survive the death of the body, when it's in our body, we usually call it a mind. He thinks after we die, we call it a soul, but it's essentially the same thing. But yeah, he thinks all we can do is speculate, but he sees the need to have a body for sensation. Now, this passage isn't the best. There are several similar passages in different books where he admits animals have sensations, but I couldn't find a good one that just kind of nailed it. But it is something that he thinks, and you can find it in several places. I tried to pick the best one. I do not deny, but that bodies may be said in a very favorable sense to have those qualities we call sensible, though there were no animals in the world. For a body in that case may differ from those bodies which are now quite devoid of quality, in its having such a disposition of its constituent corpuscles that in case it were duly applied to the sensory of an animal, it would produce a sensible quality, which a body of another texture would not. As though if there were no animals, there would be no such thing as pain. So this and in a couple of other passages, he's aware that animals have sensations. So again, this is where he differs from Descartes. Descartes thinks animals may have pain behavior, for instance, but they're really robots. They're automatons. They don't feel anything. Boyle himself did some vivisections early in his career to understand there are some parts of anatomy you can only see on a living animal. But eventually he realized the little animals were hurting and suffering, but definitely could perceive things. So again, that makes him follow Anton Wilhelm Ammo's course of action, which has its roots in Aristotelianism. So you could say this is one of the places where Boyle actually sort of agrees with Aristotle. But there's two souls. Animals have a sensitive soul, and humans have a rational soul. So yeah, I think that makes his dualism a little more sophisticated than Descartes. But he agrees non-human animals do not have a rational soul. I'm not sure I agree. I think all dogs go to heaven. But yeah, that due to religious reasons, that's what, he's trying to thread the needle. Animals have a sensitive soul because they clearly have perceptions and sensory organs. They just don't have a rational soul. For by God endowing of none but man here below with a reasonable soul, not only he is the sole visible being that can return thanks and praises in the world, and thereby is obliged to do so, both for himself and for the rest of creation. So yeah, while we're on earth, only humans have rational souls. We're getting close to wrapping it up, so just hang on with me for another couple of minutes. I said at the beginning, he's made significant progress on the mind-body problem, how something non-physical can causally interact with something physical. But I don't think he realized it, and I don't think he would have really liked it. He makes progress on that, scientific progress on the problem of consciousness, but I don't think he understood the consequences of what he was saying, or would have really liked it. So he thinks, again, maybe in heaven, when we're talking to angels and God, we'll understand how the mind and body interact, but down here we just can't. So he says, instead of dividing the operations of God into two sorts only, natural and supernatural, I think we may take in a third sort and divide the same operations into supernatural, natural in a stricter sense, that is, mechanical, and natural in a larger sense, which I call supranatural. So my mind-body interaction isn't supernatural, it's supramechanical. Whereas all the phenomena of the world as it is an aggregate or a system of mere bodies are performed by matter and local motion, according to mechanical laws, the operations of the human mind and its organized or organical body upon one another are not to be accounted for by mere matter and its mechanical powers. So, going back to the problem of consciousness and qualia, no amount of mechanical explanation will explain qualia, the subjective character of conscious experience. He thinks all natural phenomena can be explained in terms of matter and motion, but this is more supra-mechanical. So he doesn't want to say it's just supernatural, like it's occult, but it's not quite natural either. At least it's not mechanical. And so I think that leads to a position, and maybe I'm biased, but it leads to a position similar to my own, naturalistic dualism, where maybe consciousness is non-physical, but it's still a purely natural phenomenon. Okay. So Boyle's a dualist, just like Descartes and Amo, but what does he think the attributes of mind and matter are? Well, when it comes to mind, he agrees with Descartes. The attribute of mind is thought. All that mere reason can demonstrate may be reduced to these two things. One, that the rational soul, being an incorporeal substance, there's no necessity that it should perish with the body, so that if God has not otherwise appointed, the soul may survive the body and last forever. So there he's saying it's at least possible there's a non-physical afterlife for the soul. The other, the nature of the soul's attribute, its essence, according to Descartes, so he even picks Descartes out by name, consisting in its being a substance that thinks, we may conclude that thought is to be by death separate from the body, will nevertheless retain the power of thinking. So yeah, he agrees with Descartes that the attribute of mind, the essence of mind is thought. But he disagrees about the essence of matter being spatial extension. And he has a pretty good reason too. Yet the notion of body in general, that is what makes a thing to be a corporeal substance and discriminates it from other things, has been very hotly disputed of, even among the modern philosophers. And though your favorite, Descartes, how do you know my favorite was Descartes? He was just a smart guy. And though your favorite Descartes, in making the nature of body to consist in extension in every way, has a notion of it which 'tis more easy to find fault with than this inconvenience, that God cannot, within the compass of this world, wherein if any body vanish into nothing, in place or space left behind, it must have three dimensions, and so be a true body. So again, he's kind of long-winded. What he's getting at here is, for Descartes, he was a plenum theorist. He had to think that there was no such thing as empty space. All space had some kind of body in it. There was no such thing as a vacuum for Descartes, because spatial extension is the essence of body. Wherever you have a body, you have a spatial extension, and also wherever you have spatial extension, you have a body. So Descartes says things like, if you took all the bodies out of this room, the walls would have to touch, because the essence of body is spatial extension. Boyle doesn't buy it. He made a vacuum pump, for instance, after all. So yeah, he thinks it's at least possible for God to remove a body, annihilate a body from space, and not have to replace it with something else. So there could be empty space. There could be spatial extension without body. So attribute of mind is thought. He agrees with that. But the attribute of body, it's not spatial extension. It's unknown. And this is, again, part of the genius of Robert Boyle. He agrees with Descartes that the attribute of mind is thought. We can know that through introspection alone. You can just think about it and you can see it. But when it comes to matter, we have to say it's unknown. The essence of matter is not spatial extension, since empty space with matter is at least possible. And so instead we form an operative definition of matter based on experience that can be revised in light of future experimental evidence. So he's making a distinction that becomes very important in philosophy between real essence and nominal essence. What's the real essence of matter? We might never know. It's beyond our very senses to know. But we can come up with an operative definition, what we know about matter based on our experience. In doing that, sticking to the nominal definition of matter, we can revise it in light of future experience. That doesn't sound like much, but it allows his version of the mechanical philosophy to actually get farther than Descartes'. For Descartes, things like solidity, bodies are solid. Solidity isn't a mode of extension. So really, Descartes' physical objects, they're not solid. They're more purely geometrical things. physics for Descartes turns out to be applied geometry. Boyle can admit that bodies are physical and solid just because we experience it that way. So yeah, I think that's really clever. And then to wrap it up, as far as progress on the mind-body problem, I think he makes significant progress. So again, the mind-body problem, how does a non-physical mind interact with a very physical brain? When it comes to physical interaction, they bonk into each other. So one physical body can hit another. But if the mind's not physical, how can it causally interact with something physical? Well, experiment 41 of Spring of the Air may be the greatest scientific work ever written. It went on to inspire Newton's Principia Mathematica. This is the one where and you can see this very famous painting, and I knew the painter, and I can't think of it. I thought it was Wright or something. Oh, thank you so much. Very famous painting. It's hard to see in this image, but you see the evacuated receiver, and he's putting a little animal in it to the horror of the one, compassionate person in the group. I don't know if that's supposed to be Boyle, but it looks a little bit like him. What these experiments show is the dependence of consciousness on the brain. That even if consciousness is something non-physical, it's dependent on the brain. If you cut off oxygen to the brain, you lose consciousness. And so again, I think it hints toward a very naturalistic dualism. So even if the conscious mind is inherently subjective and therefore non-physical, it's still dependent on a brain. No functioning brain, no consciousness. And I don't think he would have liked that, but I think he paves the way for that understanding. You need oxygen to have consciousness. Now, what he would want to say, again, probably for religious reasons, is in these experiences, he tried to describe this by saying you're removing the sensitive soul from the bird. And if you restore air quick enough, you can reconnect the sensitive soul to the bird. I just don't think it works. If you think about it, when if you cut off oxygen to a human brain, you don't just lose your sensitive soul, you lose your rational soul too. You can't reason or have perceptions. And it's not like you're still conscious. I think his idea is, in the afterlife, you're still conscious, maybe you're not having sensations without a body. But if that was the case, then when you cut off oxygen to a brain, you'd still have some kind of conscious awareness, and you just don't. You lose consciousness. Again, he knows air is important. He doesn't quite know it's oxygen. That comes a generation later. But it does show, it paves the way for establishing the dependence of consciousness on the brain. I don't think he would have liked that result, but I think it's true. And does that solve the mind-body problem? No, but it shows there's at least a dependence relationship. So again, even if they are two different substances, there's some kind of connection there. So yeah, Robert Boyle developed a dynamic theory of mind that could account for non-human animal consciousness and pave the way for establishing the dependence of consciousness on a functioning brain. Thank you so much.